Hi, everybody. Welcome to Forbes Newsroom. I'm Diane Brady, Assistant Managing Editor at Forbes, and I'm here with Paul Barrett, who is the Deputy Director and Senior Research Scholar at the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. You've got a great report out called Spreading the Big Lie, how social media sites basically have amplified these false claims around the U.S. elections. First of all, what was the genesis of this? Why did you decide to focus on this?
Well, the main thing I'm concerned about in this report is that the backward looking big lie, the notion that Joe Biden wasn't elected legitimately in 2020, has actually metastasized into a present tense and forward looking claim that American elections are corrupt generally, that they're corrupt now as we move into the midterm elections in November 2022, and that they will be corrupt in 2024. And this theme has become a central theme for dozens and dozens of Republican candidates across the country, particularly in the key battleground states like Arizona and Michigan and Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Wisconsin. And if only a few of these people get elected in 2022, as, for example, Secretary of State,
Right.
We could have a situation in 2024 that makes the fallout from the last presidential election look mild by comparison. And the way that a lot of this false, I would call it disinformation, gets spread,
Yeah.
of course, is via social media. And the social media industry is what I focus on at NYU.
So, I mean, we know that it's an echo chamber and that, it has helped to make us more extreme. Is there some revelation in here that you think leads to actionable insights? I mean, let's start with the actual platforms themselves and their desire, at least, on a public facing way of saying that they're addressing these issues. Are they?
Well, just in the past few weeks, all of the major platforms have announced policies aimed at the 2022 midterms. Good. That's a good step. Some of these policies make sense as far as they go. They talk about labeling and possibly removing content that would mislead people about the logistics of voting, when, where, how to vote. They talk about potentially labeling, demoting in people's feeds material that would tend to make them distrust methods of voting that are entirely legitimate and effective, such as mail-in ballots or absentee ballots. All of that sounds good on paper. The problem is that the policies are not enforced consistently or vigorously enough. And if there's a central finding of the report, that's it. And you can go through these platforms, and I will if you want me to, and point out the policies that they have, and then the gaps in the policies or the failure to enforce them. And in answer to your final question, yes, there are things that the companies themselves, the companies that own these very important, very influential platforms, can do now to mitigate the harm that's taking place as we speak here this afternoon. And certainly can preempt some of the harms that will take place in 2024 unless they begin to move now.
So let's go platform by platform. So let's start with Meta, I guess, owner of, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram. And that is a case where I've certainly read that there is certainly diminished resources toward this issue than there have been previously. What have you found?
Right. Meta fiercely disputes that contention that they've dropped election security as a priority. However, let's sort of even give them the benefit of the doubt and set that to one side. They claim they've reorganized things. They used to have one coherent 300-person election integrity unit, and now they've dispersed those people into multiple other teams. Again, let's give them the benefit of the doubt on that. But let's go to one of their central efforts to deal with mis and disinformation, which is fact checking. Facebook, now Meta, has the most extensive outside fact checking program of any company in the social media industry. Kudos to them for doing that. It costs money, it takes time, and they've made that investment. However, there's a weird anomaly in their fact-checking procedure, which is they don't do any fact-checking for politicians. So this extremely influential cohort of public figures who are the main people talking about the nature of elections get a total pass from this elaborate system that Facebook has set up.
On a freedom of speech basis, or why would they exempt politicians?
It dates back to now increasingly antiquated policies that Mark Zuckerberg put in place years ago, before 2016 and the interference by the Russians in the presidential election then, and our collective realization of how manipulable the platforms really are. And that traditional outlook was, we are not arbiters of the truth. We are just a passive platform. We just put material up there and our users make of it what they will. That has gone by the boards in the wake of the Russian manipulation, in the wake of the many, many revelations of domestically generated disinformation, and particularly in the wake of 2020, when we had the dual phenomena of the COVID pandemic and a really unusually bitter and disinformation-laden election that required the social media companies to take responsibility for what was on their platforms, both in connection with health information, vaccinations, masking, what you should do for your children on the one hand, and trying to deal with false information on that front, and on the other hand, trying to deal with the false information that was generated by former President Trump and his supporters, who tried to basically prepare us for an election by saying that if we don't win, if I, Trump, don't win, then the election will have been rigged, which by the time we got to the election led to this situation where a significant portion of the population simply rejected the results of the election, culminating in the mob insurrection, January 6th, 2021 at the Capitol. So we're not arbiters of the truth. It really is yesterday's slogan.
Right.
Facebook, its sister platforms, Instagram and the rest, are now, for better or for worse, trying to sort out not just what is hate speech, not just what is harassment, but also what's true and what's false on important public civic issues. It's a very complicated undertaking. It's not easy. I'm not here to say that it's a panacea, given the volume of material on these platforms. Billions of users, billions of posts each day, collectively speaking, across these platforms. It's impossible to find everything that's not true. But on very prominent, important issues, they are trying, but they have these weird anomalies that are remnants of old now, basically.
Right. Well, exempting politicians is a huge anomaly when you're talking on an election context. Let's go to Twitter, because that is a case where we clearly saw, President Trump was kicked off, A, and B, they have been under scrutiny for a number of different reasons recently. What did you find about that platform?
Yes, the conditions at Twitter are as you described them. I would add another factor there, which is, unlike Meta, unlike Google, the parent of YouTube, and unlike TikTok, the new competitor that has risen to prominence so swiftly and has been so successful, Twitter is not a particularly successful company from a financial point of view. It's also much smaller than these other companies, does not have a large parent company behind it. Nevertheless, at Twitter, they have made some respectable efforts to superintend the platform. They have what they call a civic integrity policy. And that sounds, its terms are perfectly reasonable. As you say, when President Trump was basically inciting violence in the wake of the 2020 election, they eventually said, this is too much. Even though you're the president of the United States, even though there's an interest in people knowing what you're saying, if you're actually going to incite a riot and threaten to do that in the future, we just can't have that on our platform. So good. I salute them for having done that. Facebook, by the way, and YouTube ultimately did the same as well. So Twitter has this civic integrity policy. But bizarrely, in my mind, when time rolled around to March 2021, and the protesters and hooligans had been ousted from the Capitol, and no one was threatening in an immediate way to hang Mike Pence anymore, Twitter simply stopped enforcing its civic integrity policy. It put it on hiatus, and it was on hiatus for 16 months until a few weeks ago. Wow. Now, this, you can say, well, we're a smallish company. We don't have the resources to enforce this all the time. We flip the on switch around the time of elections, and then we turn it off once the election is concluded. There's a superficial logic to that, and the idea that they don't have the same resources as Facebook, that's true. But the problem is, you guys built this system. Right. You have 330 million monthly average users around the world, and you have a particularly influential platform that really punches above its weight class because it's used by so many prominent people. In light of all that, you simply have to figure out how the resources can be deployed to keep that platform safe. If you've got policies that you think are necessary to protect elections, that's got to be a 24/7, 365-day-a-year undertaking, because the no-goodniks are not stopping in between elections. And that's exactly what we've seen. And election denialism, this mindset that all of our elections have become corrupt, gained a great deal of momentum on Twitter, because Twitter basically, took a nap from March 2021 until August of 2022.
So one of the newer contenders is TikTok, well, let's just talk as a straight up platform. Is that an influential platform when it comes to, how we perceive elections?
Surprisingly, the answer is increasingly it is. We still think of it, at least I thought of it until very recently, as exactly, the funny 10-second, dance videos, that's harmless. Maybe the kids are, using nasty language or dressing a little too racially. But who cares about that? It's not a terrible thing. But the fact is, you build a platform that gets very, very popular, on the order of magnitude of 1 billion users now, and you build an algorithm that's extremely effective at serving up to people what they like and enjoy, so that they stay on the screen longer, and eventually. People trying to manipulate other people in connection with politics, consumer goods, international affairs, they're going to gravitate there too. And that is what happened. We've now seen this repeatedly. Facebook was not set up to spread political disinformation. It was set up so you could keep track of your high school classmates, or, the cute, what it was built for originally was to pass around pictures of the cute girls at Harvard when Zuckerberg was an undergraduate there. But it evolves, and technology can end up, empowering activity that you didn't anticipate at first, which is why you have to be very careful in how you deploy technology. So TikTok, it is this, very kind of addictive and alluring platform. And they, to their credit, I have to say, they've instituted very broad-reaching policies related to elections. The problem is, it's almost impossible to figure out how they're enforcing. It's completely erratic. And the only way to really illustrate this is to give you an example. When I began poking around on TikTok in connection with this report, I put in various search terms just to see what the nature of the material that would be generated. So you put in election fraud, which is very broad, and you think that's sort of a straightforward thing. Right. And that they have blocked completely.
Oh, they've blocked people from even searching for the term?
Yeah, you can't, wow. Nothing comes up. You get a message that, the content associated with this term may violate our guidelines. Go look at our community guidelines. So that's a little weird in and of itself. But then I put in sort of an associated term, which is a particular type of alleged election fraud, so-called ballot trafficking, meaning people taking multiple ballots that aren't theirs and depositing them at the polling place or in a Dropbox, what have you. And that yields a panoply of hits, literally, hundreds and thousands of hits, many of them spreading the false notion that ballot trafficking is a common form of corruption in American elections when it just is not. There is no evidence of that. This is an illustration of a platform that sort of knows it should be doing something, but can't quite figure out exactly what to do or how to do it. They haven't thought it through carefully enough. So when I called them up and said, "Hey, I want to talk to you about these things," and I pointed out, a bunch of individual, TikTok kind of micro influencer types. Some of them, they look like they were 20-something young women, but they're talking about ballot trafficking and the rest. It's very surprising. I said, how are you guys, applying your rules? The rules seem fine, but how are you applying them? And they gave me kind of an explanation, which I included in the report. And they said a few days later, by the way, all the posts that you pointed out to us and the search for ballot trafficking, we've blocked all of those now. So,
well, Chinese owned, is that? Let me ask about the, one of the things that came up in your conclusions is certainly when you look at Republicans versus Democrats, and the perception is that this misinformation really is a Republican phenomenon. Is that the case? I mean, this really, I know we're talking red state, blue state. Is there equal amounts of disinformation on both sides, or?
No, this is not a symmetric phenomenon. It is heavily asymmetric, and in the fashion that you suggest, which is to say, study after study done by academic social scientists shows that both conservative politicians and conservative rank and file voters go to sites that are known for publishing misinformation more frequently, share that information more readily, and their opinions are changed more often by that kind of information. This is presumably an outgrowth of the direction that the Republican Party has taken in the last, 15 years in general, where it has gone from being the party of Ronald Reagan, who was very conservative, Bob Dole, John McCain, to the party of Donald Trump. There's been a lot of change. The Democrats have, by some measures, moved to the left somewhat, but not at all by the same amount. And Democrats tend to get their information from center and center-left sources, while increasingly Republicans are getting their information from very far-right sources online. The best measure of this is that fully 70%, more than 2/3 of Republicans, consistently tell pollsters that Joe Biden was not legitimately elected the president. This is an extraordinary situation where you can go 2 years after an election, or nearly 2 years, and a good portion of the country just doesn't accept the outcome from the last presidential election.
Yeah, it's hard to glean necessarily from doing research, but certainly the last election, one of the biggest issues was just foreign interference, Russia, etc. Is that something that you looked at? Is it something that really is relevant, frankly, to this discussion? Who is the source of this disinformation versus what the actual information is?
Oh, it's absolutely critical, because it will affect how you respond to the situation. And the two scenarios are quite distinct. If you have a foreign nation state, such as Russia, although you should also add to that group countries like Iran and China, and they are and operatives from those countries are disguising themselves as being from other countries, say Americans, and opening accounts, and getting into flame wars with people's, buying advertisements, fostering divisiveness or favoring a particular politician. That's actually illegal in a clean, straightforward way. a non-American can't, under false pretenses, under fraudulently set up social media accounts pretending to be one person, and then set about to interfere with an election. That violates laws, and people coming out of 2016 were indicted by the federal government. Not that anybody was put in prison, because they remain in Russia. They're not within our jurisdiction. But that's one situation, and that's actually something that law enforcement authorities are concerned about and are willing to investigate and prosecute. There's no question there about free speech issues, because you don't have a First Amendment right to disguise yourself as another person from a different country and interfere with an election. It's a very different question to be an American, either under your name or under somebody else's name. Twitter, for example, doesn't double check and see whether you really are who you say you are, and simply say that elections in this country are corrupt. That could be seen as a straightforward opinion. And in normal times, you might say, well, you certainly wouldn't want the government getting involved with that. The government judging whose political views, even if those views are based on falsehoods, are valid or not. So the government gets taken out of the picture altogether. The First Amendment protects speech, even when it's outrageous speech, and often even sometimes when it's even false and outrageous speech, because it's difficult to determine truth or falsity. So with domestically generated disinformation coming from authentic sources, and sometimes even from inauthentic sources, it's a much more complicated undertaking to figure out how to counter it. All that said, these individual platforms can permit or not permit anybody they want from talking on their platforms. They are private companies that operate online venues, and it is fully within their authority to say who gets to play in their playground. And the First Amendment should not be held up as a kind of fake way of confusing people into thinking that a Facebook or a TikTok doesn't have the authority to decide who gets to express themselves on them.
Well, and you do have recommendations. Most of them are sort of self-governance regulations. And let me say that, recommendations. You mentioned 475 voter fraud cases. Are there many cases or any real move on the regulatory front to actually be imposing some of these recommendations on the platforms? Is there much momentum there? Because we hear about it, but we don't hear a lot of action.
Right. So yes, the platforms can self-regulate in almost any way they choose. I can go through some of those recommendations if you like. In answer to the question you've asked, which is what can or ought the government to be doing, there are things the government can do. Political disinformation and misinformation are probably the last category of problematic content that you would want the government to get involved with, because they sit so close.
Interested actor.
Yeah, and ordinary sort of political debate. I mean, you don't want the government, getting close to regulating, what we argue about when we argue about politics. However, that said, we've made a proposal. It's not detailed in this report, although I allude to it and link to it in earlier reports, that the government could get more involved, and should, by using its consumer protection authority more expansively via the Federal Trade Commission, to require that these platforms deliver on the promises that they make, so that if they promise that they have a content moderation system, that they actually have an adequately resourced, adequately designed content moderation procedure. Not the government making decisions about particular policies, let alone particular content decisions. The government should never be doing it. That's what the First Amendment is all about. But the government can require a social media company to deliver on its promise of moderating content the same way it can require a car company to deliver on its promise of selling you a car that has an engine in it, as opposed to you get the car and it doesn't move. Another tighter analogy is cases the FTC has brought against all manner of companies that have promised cybersecurity to their customers. So a hotel, for example, when you rent a room overnight, has in the fine print, we will protect your personal data if you use a credit card. And then it turns out that the hotel doesn't have a good cybersecurity program, and thousands of people have had their personal data stolen by Russian fraudsters. That's an FTC case, and the FTC has brought many of those cases. I think that's pretty closely analogous to the issue of whether social media companies have procedurally adequate content moderation systems.
So, Paul, I guess the last point is really about to the average viewer who may be concerned about disinformation. Of course, we all process this stuff, according to our pre-existing beliefs, but what message do you have to them as we head into the midterms? We use these platforms. Caveat emptor, like just beware?
Caveat, big emptor. Individuals have responsibilities too. They have responsibilities to understand the technology they're using and not to abuse it themselves. The millions, now billions of people who use social media platforms are part of the picture here. It's very difficult to force people to be responsible in how they speak about politics or public life or anything for that matter. But using common sense, being skeptical about the origins of the information that they both absorb themselves, and even more importantly, that they then retweet or share or pass on to other people. Because when you share something, the people you're sharing it with, assuming that you have some kind of relationship, or at least you're in the same network, they're going to assume it's more credible because it's coming from you. They know you, or they know who you are by category. And there've been all kinds of research showing that people take as more credible information that's been passed along by people they know. So that's a responsibility, and it's something that individuals need to think about as well, because we are all part of this picture.
Great. Thank you very much.